Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the harder you try to hold on to something, the faster it slips away? You text more, they reply less. You follow up again, they get busy. You push to close the deal, the client suddenly needs more time. You try harder to impress, people seem less impressed. It's weird, right? You'd think effort would help. You'd think showing more interest would create more interest. You'd think leaning in would make someone lean back toward you. But somehow, it often does the opposite. And if you've ever felt that quiet frustration, that moment where you think, why am I the only one pushing here? You're not alone. Most people respond to uncertainty the same way. They chase. They try to fix it with more energy, more words, more reassurance, more presence. Because doing something feels better than doing nothing. Silence feels dangerous. Waiting feels weak. So we push. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When you push too hard, you don't create connection. You create pressure. And pressure changes the entire dynamic. Think about it like this. Imagine someone standing very close to you. Not aggressively, just a little too close. You can feel it. There's nothing technically wrong, but something inside you tightens. Your body wants space. Not because you hate the person, not because they did something terrible, but because humans need room. Now apply that to conversations, to relationships, to business, to attraction. When someone feels like they're being pulled toward a decision, a response, or a commitment before they're ready, something kicks in, a subtle resistance. It doesn't announce itself loudly, it shows up quietly. Shorter replies, delayed answers, vague language, less enthusiasm. And then the worst part happens. You notice the shift. And instead of slowing down, you speed up. You send another message, you clarify, you explain, you reassure. You try to close the gap. But every extra push makes the other person lean back a little more. It becomes this invisible tug of war. The more you pull, the more they resist. And the crazy thing is, both sides usually mean well. The chaser isn't evil, they're anxious. They don't want to lose the connection. They don't want the deal to fall through. They don't want the opportunity to disappear. So they apply pressure without realizing it. And the other side isn't cruel. They just don't want to feel cornered. Nobody likes feeling cornered. Nobody likes feeling like their freedom is shrinking, even if the outcome might be good. That's the paradox. You can be offering something valuable, a relationship, a partnership, a great opportunity, but if the delivery feels urgent, heavy, or desperate, the value gets overshadowed by the pressure. Let me say that again. Pressure kills perceived value. Because when something feels forced, it stops feeling chosen. And people want to feel like they chose, not like they were pushed. Have you ever walked into a store just browsing and the salesperson follows you immediately? Can I help you? What are you looking for? Are you ready to check out? Even if you were slightly interested, what happens? You slow down. You say you're just looking. You might even leave. Not because you hate the product, but because the pressure changed your emotional state. Now imagine the opposite. You walk in. No one bothers you. You explore at your own pace. You pick something up. You consider it. You choose it. That feels better because the decision feels like yours. This dynamic shows up everywhere. In dating, in friendships, in job interviews, in negotiations, even in leadership. The moment someone feels like their autonomy is shrinking, they instinctively protect it. And when you push too hard, that's exactly what happens. You shrink the other person's space. Now here's the part that's hard to hear. Sometimes when you chase, it's not about them, it's about your discomfort. You don't like uncertainty. You don't like knowing where you stand. You don't like waiting. So you try to force clarity. But clarity forced too early doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like pressure. And pressure rarely produces enthusiasm. It produces compliance at best, resistance at worst. That's why sometimes when you stop pushing, not to play games, not to manipulate, but simply to remove pressure, something interesting happens. The dynamic shifts. The silence stops feeling like rejection, it starts feeling like space. And space gives people room to move toward you voluntarily. But before we get into how that works, you have to understand this first. Chasing isn't strength. It feels active, it feels bold, it feels like you're doing something, but often it signals that you're afraid to let things unfold naturally. And fear changes your energy. People can feel it, even if they can't explain it. So if you've ever wondered why the harder you try, the worse it seems to go, it's not random, it's not bad luck, it's a human reaction to pressure. And once you see that clearly, everything starts to make more sense. Next, we're going to break down why stepping back, when done right, can completely change the dynamic. Not because it's a trick, but because it aligns with how people are wired.
So if chasing creates pressure, why does pulling back change everything? It's not magic, it's wiring. Human beings are built with a deep need for autonomy. We want to feel like we're choosing, not complying, not being managed, not being nudged into something before we're ready. The moment we sense that our freedom is shrinking, even slightly, something inside us tightens. It's subtle, but it's real. You felt it before. Someone tells you that you have to do something, even if you were already planning to do it. Suddenly, you don't want to. Not because the action changed, but because the feeling changed. That feeling is resistance. And resistance doesn't show up only when someone is aggressive. It shows up when someone is overly eager, overly available, overly invested. When you chase too hard, you accidentally communicate this: I need this to happen. And need creates weight. Weight creates pressure. Pressure creates distance. Now here's where it gets interesting. When you step back, calmly, confidently, without drama, the pressure disappears. And when pressure disappears, space opens up. Space is powerful, because in space, people start thinking for themselves. When you stop texting every few hours, they notice the silence. When you stop pushing for the decision, they start evaluating it on their own. When you stop over-explaining your value, they start wondering. Silence creates curiosity, and curiosity is much stronger than persuasion. You can talk someone into something, but when they talk themselves into it, that's solid. Think about it like this. Imagine someone constantly trying to convince you they're high value. I'm reliable, I'm smart, I'm different, trust me. The more they say it, the less convincing it feels. Now imagine someone who simply shows up, does their thing, and doesn't chase approval. You lean in, you start observing, you start evaluating. And in that evaluation, value increases. Why? Because it feels scarce. Not unavailable, not playing games, just not desperate. Scarcity isn't about disappearing, it's about not overflooding. When something is everywhere, all the time, instantly accessible, it feels less special. When something has rhythm, presence, and pause, it feels alive. Pulling back restores rhythm. Most chasing behavior kills rhythm. It's constant. Ping, follow up, clarify, reassure, repeat. It feels like noise, and humans tune out noise. But when there's quiet draws attention. There's another layer here that most people miss. When you step back, you're not only changing how the other person feels, you're changing how you feel. Chasing puts you in reaction mode. You're waiting, watching, analyzing response times, measuring tone. That puts the other person at the center of your emotional state. Pulling back recenters you. Your day isn't dictated by their reply. Your mood isn't determined by their enthusiasm. That internal shift is visible, not because people can read your thoughts, but because your energy stabilizes. You're no longer vibrating with urgency, and urgency is loud. Calm is quiet. Quiet confidence is magnetic. Not flashy, not dramatic, just steady. There's a difference between someone who wants something and someone who needs something. When you pull back the right way, you move from need to preference. I'd like this to happen, instead of I can't afford for this to fail. That shift is everything. Because when someone senses that you'll be okay either way, they relax. They don't feel responsible for your emotional stability. They don't feel like they're being dragged toward a finish line. They feel free, and freedom makes people more open. Here's the paradox. When you try to control the outcome tightly, you lose control. When you loosen your grip, influence increases. It's like holding sand in your hand. Clench your fist, it spills. Open your palm, it stays.
Pulling back isn't about disappearing, it's about removing unnecessary force. It's about letting the other person experience their own desire without interference. And desire that forms internally is far stronger than desire created by pressure. The mistake people make is thinking that intensity equals impact. It doesn't. Intensity often equals anxiety. Impact comes from timing, from restraint, from knowing when you've done enough. And most people never learn when to stop. They keep adding more words, more proof, more persuasion. But sometimes the most powerful move is subtraction. Less talking, less chasing, less emotional leakage. When you remove the pressure, two things can happen. They lean in or they don't. Both outcomes are useful. Because if someone only responds when chased, that tells you something. And if they move closer when space appears, that tells you something too. Either way, you gain clarity. And clarity is power. Not control over them, control over yourself. Pulling back works because it restores balance. It shifts the dynamic from push and resist to choose and respond. And people always prefer choosing, even when they choose you. Now here's where people mess this up. They hear "stop chasing" and they swing to the other extreme. They disappear. They act cold. They reply 2 days later on purpose. They pretend they don't care. That's not strength. That's insecurity wearing a mask. Pulling back only works under one condition. You've already shown up. You've already expressed interest. You've already made your move. If you've never stepped forward, stepping back does nothing. You can't create space if there was no presence. That's the first mistake. Some people think being mysterious means being unavailable. No. Mystery isn't silence. Mystery is clarity without overexposure. If someone doesn't know you're interested at all, they're not feeling pressure. They're feeling nothing. And nothing doesn't create attraction. So the sequence matters. Step forward with confidence. Make your intention clear, then stop pushing. That's different from playing hard to get. Playing hard to get is strategic distance. Healthy distance is emotional stability. Huge difference. Here's another place people get it wrong. They use pulling back as a test. They think, let me disappear and see if they chase. That energy is manipulative, and people feel it. Because it's still reactive. It's still about controlling the outcome. Real pulling back isn't a test, it's a release. It's saying, I've done my part, now I'm letting this breathe. No resentment, no silent punishment, no scoreboard, just space. There's also a hard truth here. Sometimes you stop chasing and nothing happens. They don't lean in. They don't reach out. They don't suddenly realize your value. That doesn't mean the principle failed. It means the interest wasn't there to begin with, and chasing was the only thing keeping it alive. That's uncomfortable, but it's powerful information. If someone only stays when you apply pressure, that connection isn't stable. It's dependency, and dependency is fragile. Pulling back reveals reality. That's why it feels risky. You're removing the artificial support. You're seeing what stands on its own. And sometimes the answer is not much. That's not a loss, that's clarity. Now, let's talk about when this really works. It works when there's mutual interest but imbalance in energy. It works when both sides care, but one side is overcompensating. It works when you've created pressure unintentionally. In those situations, space restores equilibrium. Think of it like this. If two people are leaning toward each other equally, balance feels natural. But if one person leans too far forward, the other has to lean back just to stay upright. That leaning back isn't rejection, it's balance correction. When you straighten yourself up, the other person doesn't have to lean away anymore. Everything stabilizes. That's why restraint works. Not because it tricks someone, but because it removes imbalance. There's another dimension people overlook. Pulling back only works if you're genuinely okay with either outcome. If you're secretly panicking inside, if every hour of silence feels like torture, if you're constantly checking your phone, your energy will still feel tight, and tension leaks. You don't have to say anything. It shows in tone, in timing, in micro-reactions. Real space comes from emotional independence, not fake distance. That's why this isn't about tactics, it's about internal posture. If you're stepping back while thinking, "I hope this makes them want me," that's still chasing. You're just chasing silently. But if you're stepping back because you trust that what's meant to move toward you will, that's different. That's grounded. Here's something else important. This principle doesn't mean never following up. It doesn't mean never clarifying. It doesn't mean becoming passive. Passivity isn't attractive. Confidence is. Confidence says, "I'm interested," and also, "I'm not forcing this." That balance is rare. Most people are either overly aggressive or overly detached. Very few are steady. And steadiness stands out because it feels safe. It feels strong. It feels like someone who doesn't collapse under uncertainty. And uncertainty is where most people reveal their insecurity. Pulling back works when it's rooted in self-respect. It fails when it's rooted in fear. It works when it restores balance. It fails when it's used as a weapon. It works when you've shown value already. It fails when you're hiding instead of engaging. So before you decide to step back, ask yourself one question. Am I creating space, or am I trying to trigger a reaction? If the answer is reaction, it won't hold. If the answer is space, it might change everything. Because space doesn't force, it reveals. And what gets revealed is always more useful than what gets forced.
Here's something most people don't realize. Pulling back isn't really about the other person. It's about you. Because chasing doesn't just create pressure outward, it creates chaos inward. When you're in chase mode, your emotional state becomes reactive. You wake up and check your phone. You measure response times. You reread messages. You analyze tone. You interpret pauses. Your mood rises and falls based on tiny signals. That's exhausting. And the worst part? You slowly hand over your emotional control. Now, someone else's attention determines your stability. That's not power. That's dependency. When you step back, something subtle shifts. Your nervous system calms down. You're not waiting. You're not bracing. You're not refreshing a screen. You start focusing on your own rhythm again, your own day, your own direction. And that internal shift changes how you show up everywhere. Because urgency has a frequency. People can feel it, not consciously, but energetically. When someone needs a response, needs validation, needs progress, their tone tightens, their timing shortens, their presence feels heavy, even if their words sound normal. Stepping back lowers that frequency. You move slower, you speak cleaner, you stop oversharing to fill silence. You stop explaining yourself twice. You stop trying to secure outcomes prematurely. And suddenly, you feel stronger. Not because you won, but because you're no longer grasping. There's a psychological reset that happens when you stop chasing. You begin to see the situation more clearly. When you're chasing, everything feels high stakes. Every message matters. Every delay feels meaningful. But when you step back, perspective returns. You realize not every pause is rejection. Not every slow reply is disinterest. Not every delay is disaster. Distance reduces distortion. Emotion amplifies stories. Space corrects them. There's another powerful change that happens. When you stop chasing, you start observing. Instead of pushing for reassurance, you watch patterns. Do they initiate? Do they follow through? Do they invest? Or were you carrying the weight the entire time? You can't see imbalance clearly when you're the one constantly adjusting. But when you stop adjusting, imbalance becomes obvious. And awareness is freedom, because now you're making decisions from clarity, not anxiety. Let's talk about identity for a second. When you chase too hard, you subtly communicate something to yourself. This is scarce. I can't lose this. That belief shrinks you. It makes you act smaller, more accommodating, more reactive. When you step back, even slightly, you reinforce a different belief. I'll be fine either way. That belief expands you. And expansion is attractive, not just to others,
to yourself. You start respecting your own time more. You stop over-investing in uncertainty. You stop proving your value repeatedly. You let your presence speak for itself. And here's the real shift. You move from seeking approval to offering opportunity. That's a completely different posture. One feels like, please choose me. The other feels like, I'm here. If this aligns, great. That second energy is calm. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It doesn't collapse when things stall. It trusts that alignment will show itself. Stepping back also exposes fear, because when you stop chasing, silence appears, and silence forces you to sit with uncertainty. You can't distract yourself with action. You can't flood the situation with effort. You just have to wait. And waiting reveals whether you're grounded or anxious. That discomfort is growth, because once you survive a few silences without panicking, something changes. You realize you don't need constant feedback to stay steady. You don't need immediate validation to feel secure. You don't need control over timing to feel safe. That realization builds internal stability, and stability is rare. Most people operate from impulse, impulse to respond, impulse to clarify, impulse to secure, impulse to fix. Very few people can pause. Very few people can hold silence without interfering. Very few people can let a situation breathe without interfering. When you become that person, you feel different, less scattered, less urgent, less attached to outcomes. And here's the irony. When you're no longer attached to forcing outcomes, you often get better ones. Because now your decisions are cleaner. You're not overcompensating. You're not negotiating from fear. You're not investing in someone who's barely investing back. You're choosing, not reacting. And that internal shift changes every interaction you have. You walk slower. You talk clearer. You think longer. You don't rush to fill empty space. You let people reveal themselves. That's power. Not dominance, not manipulation. Composure. Stepping back trains composure, and composure compounds. Once you learn how to stay steady in one situation, you bring that steadiness into the next, then the next. Eventually, you're not someone who chases, you're someone who moves with intention. And intention always feels stronger than urgency, because urgency feels like fear. Intention feels like direction. When you stop chasing, you don't become passive, you become deliberate. And deliberate people don't get pulled around by every shift in energy. They observe, they respond, they decide. That's what stepping back really does. It upgrades your internal posture. And once your posture changes, the dynamic outside you usually follows.
So now the real question is simple. How do you actually apply this without turning into someone cold, distant, or fake? Because the goal isn't to manipulate. The goal isn't to win. The goal is to stay grounded. Let's make this practical. First, slow your reactions. Not your interest, not your personality, just your reactions. When someone takes longer to reply, don't instantly adjust your energy. When a deal pauses, don't immediately send 3 follow-ups. When you feel uncertainty rising, don't rush to fix it. Pause. Most overchasing happens in emotional spikes. You feel ignored. You feel unsure. You feel slightly rejected. So you react. But if you wait even a little, emotion drops. And when emotion drops, clarity comes back. Half the things you wanted to say in panic won't feel necessary anymore. That pause alone changes everything. Second, match effort. This one is simple but powerful. If someone invests, invest back. If someone pulls slightly, don't sprint forward to compensate. Let things be proportional. Chasing usually comes from imbalance. You give 80, they give 30. Instead of recalibrating, you give 100. That doesn't fix imbalance, it amplifies it. Matching effort restores equilibrium, and equilibrium feels natural. Third, stop over-explaining yourself. When people feel insecure, they add more words, more clarification, more proof, more reassurance.
But excessive explanation lowers perceived confidence. State your interest clearly once. State your position clearly once. Then let it breathe. If it requires constant reinforcement to survive, it probably wasn't stable to begin with. Fourth, build a life that doesn't revolve around one outcome. This is the one nobody wants to hear. If one person's reply controls your mood, you're too invested. If one deal determines your self-worth, you're too dependent. If one opportunity feels like your only shot, you'll grip too tightly. The solution isn't pretending not to care. The solution is expanding your world. More projects, more movement, more growth. When your life is full, you naturally stop squeezing one thing so hard because your identity isn't hanging on it, and that changes your energy automatically. Fifth, be genuinely okay with losing. This is the real test. If you're stepping back as a tactic, it won't work long term. If you're stepping back because you trust that what's aligned will stay, that's different. People can feel the difference. When you're secretly terrified of losing something, your tone tightens, your timing shifts, your composure cracks. When you're okay either way, you stay steady. And steadiness is powerful. Not loud, not dramatic, just solid. There's also something important here. This doesn't mean you never initiate. It doesn't mean you never express interest. It doesn't mean you become passive. Confidence moves forward when it wants to. It just doesn't chase when it senses resistance. That's the difference. Move with intention, not desperation. Express clearly, then observe. And here's the part most people miss. Space reveals truth faster than pressure. If someone leans in when you stop pushing, there was interest. If someone disappears when you stop carrying the weight, that tells you something too. Either way, you gain clarity, and clarity is worth more than forced attachment. Think about holding sand in your hand. If you squeeze it tightly, it slips through your fingers. If you hold your palm open, most of it stays. The goal was never to clench harder. It was to hold with control. That's the shift. Not aggressive, not passive, not manipulative, just controlled. When you stop chasing, you don't lose power. You regain composure. You regain perspective. You regain self-respect. And once you operate from that place, dynamics naturally change. Because the most attractive energy in any situation, relationships, business, leadership, is someone who wants the outcome but doesn't need it. That balance is rare, and rare always carries weight.